On the day I was supposed to begin my new life, I stood at the altar in St. Philip's Church with my wedding dress clinging to me like a cage and my stepmother's hands closed around my throat. Guests gasped, the priest froze, and my father stared helplessly as if he were a stranger in his own daughter's story. For a moment, the world blurred into silence, and I thought I might collapse before speaking the truth I had carried inside me for 24 hours. That truth was simple, yet devastating. My fiancé Daniel had not been mine the night before our wedding. He had been with Chloe, my stepsister, in a hotel room across town, leaving me to smile and pretend while they whispered promises in the dark. My name is Samantha Whitmore. I am 19 years old, and until that day I believed that marriage would be my escape from the cruelty of my stepmother Linda, from the manipulation of Chloe, and from the silence of my father Mark, who had abandoned his strength long ago. Instead, I discovered that betrayal was waiting for me at every corner of my family, and even in the man I thought would save me. I had dreamed of this wedding for months. I had told myself that walking down the aisle would mean freedom, that Daniel's hand in mine would be proof that love could wash away the poison I had endured at home. I imagined that once I became his wife, Linda's words would no longer cut me, Chloe's smirks would no longer matter, and my father's weakness would no longer define my life. But in that church, surrounded by more than 100 guests dressed in their finest clothes, I realized I had been preparing for a different kind of day. It would not be the day I gained a husband. It would be the day I gained my voice. The night before, I had sat alone by my window in Charleston's historic district, staring at the rooftops and promising myself that no matter what, I would carry dignity into tomorrow. Hours later, that promise shattered when I saw the message on Daniel's laptop, the one that slipped through the cracks of his carelessness. It was Chloe's name glowing on the screen, her words dripping with triumph. The details cut into me like glass. My heart pounded so hard that I could not breathe, and yet my mind became sharp, clearer than it had ever been. If Linda had taught me anything, it was how to endure humiliation silently. If Chloe had taught me anything, it was how to recognize envy and spite hiding behind a smile. If Daniel had taught me anything, it was how betrayal feels when it wears the mask of devotion. At that moment, I decided that I would not run. I would not cry into a pillow and vanish into shame. I would let them believe they had succeeded until I stood in the place where they wanted me blind, and then I would make the truth undeniable. That is why when Linda's fingers pressed against my throat at the altar, I did not collapse in fear. I looked into her eyes and felt something rise in me that had been buried for years. Rage, yes, but also clarity. I saw her not as a mother figure or a tyrant, but as a desperate woman watching control slip from her grasp. Around us, the congregation whispered and fumbled with their phones, some already scanning the small cards I had given them that morning, cards that contained the evidence of Daniel and Chloe's secret. The church was moments away from exploding into chaos, but in those seconds, I felt calm. For 19 years, my life had been dictated by the cruelty of others. In that instant, I realized it was about to be defined by me. I was no longer the silent daughter, no longer the submissive bride, no longer the girl who believed that escape would come from someone else's love. I was standing at the center of betrayal, my stepmother's hands around my throat, and yet I had never felt stronger. Growing up in Charleston meant that beauty was always around me, but inside my home it often felt like shadows stretched across every room. I was only 10 when my mother passed away, and from that moment, the rhythm of our house changed forever. My father, Mark Whitmore, was a banker who wore pressed shirts and quiet resignation in equal measure. He was kind in his way, but kindness without strength is like a locked door without a key. When he remarried 2 years later, I prayed that his choice would bring us healing. Instead, it brought us Linda. She owned a flower shop near King Street, and from the outside, people admired her energy and her immaculate bouquets. To the world, she was elegance, but behind closed doors, she was a force that demanded control over every breath I took. Linda judged everything about me. If my grades were high, she said I was showing off. If I stayed quiet, she said I was ungrateful. When she looked at me, I felt like I was being measured and always found lacking. It was not the kind of cruelty that leaves visible marks, but the kind that makes you question whether you deserve to exist at all. Soon after Chloe came into my life, She was Linda's daughter from her first marriage, just a year older than me, and she carried her mother's confidence like a weapon. Chloe was the kind of girl who always walked into a room certain she was the center of it. Teachers praised her charm, classmates envied her style, and she made sure I understood that in this new family I would always be the shadow. At dinner, she rolled her eyes when I spoke. At school, she whispered jokes at my expense. Sometimes she pretended to be sweet to me in front of others, but when we were alone, she dropped the mask. I can still hear her saying that I would never be chosen first for anything not by friends, not by love, not even by my own father. Those words dug deep, and when my father looked away, instead of defending me, they rooted into my heart. Life in that house became a daily negotiation. I learned when to stay silent, when to nod, when to disappear into my room. I told myself that I only had to survive until I was old enough to leave. Every birthday was a countdown, every calendar year a step closer to freedom. Yet freedom felt so far away. The only comfort I found was in the quiet moments when I could walk along the Battery after school, the breeze carrying the scent of salt water reminding me that the world was bigger than our house. I clung to those walks, imagining a future where someone might see me for who I was, not for what Linda said I was not. When I turned 16, the walls of our house seemed to close in even tighter. Linda had made it clear that my future was not mine to decide. She wanted me to work at her flower shop after school, arranging roses and lilies until my fingers were raw, yet she never paid me $1. She told neighbors that I was lazy, even while I carried boxes heavier than my frame. Whenever I asked my father if I could take another part-time job, maybe at the bookstore downtown or a cafe near the market, he shook his head and told me to keep the peace. Peace in our house was just another word for surrender. Chloe thrived in that environment because it was built for her. She wore the newest clothes, drove a car Linda bought her for her 18th birthday, and spoke with the careless arrogance of someone who had never been told no. She went off to the College of Charleston, posting pictures of herself with friends at rooftop bars and beach parties. Whenever she came home, she looked at me as though I were frozen in place, while she was already living the life I could never reach. My father bragged about her grades to anyone who would listen as if he had forgotten I had once been on track for a scholarship before Linda convinced him that keeping me close was safer. I remember the night I received a letter offering me a partial scholarship to study literature out of state. It felt like a door had opened, but Linda tore it off its hinges. She told my father that a girl like me would get lost, that I was not strong enough to be alone, that I would waste money we did not have. My father nodded like her words were gospel. I watched the letter sit on the counter until it disappeared into the trash. That night, I cried into my pillow not because I believed her, but because I realized how easily he did. Still, I found fragments of light where I could. I volunteered at the library on weekends, sneaking moments between the stacks of books to imagine characters braver than I was. I walked along King Street pretending I was a tourist, not a prisoner. And in those small rebellions, I planted the seed of a belief that maybe one day I would write my own story. I carried that fragile hope into my 17th year when I met Daniel Brooks at a community event near Mount Pleasant. He was helping his uncle fix a booth at the marina, his hands steady, his laugh easy. He noticed me standing alone and asked if I liked the sea. It was such a simple question, but it felt like someone had finally seen me, not the version Linda created. From that moment, my heart tilted toward him, and for the first time in years, I felt the possibility of escape. Daniel became the kind of presence I had only read about in the books I shelved at the library. He worked long hours at the shipyard in Mount Pleasant, the smell of salt water clinging to his jacket, but he always found time to see me. He asked about my dreams and actually listened when I spoke. When I told him about the scholarship I had lost, he said I was more capable than anyone gave me credit for. When I admitted that my house felt like a prison, he promised that one day I would not have to return there. Those words filled me with a hope so sharp it almost hurt. Every date with him was a small rebellion. We would drive out to Sullivan's Island watching the waves crash against the sand, and for a few hours I was not Linda's stepdaughter or Chloe's shadow. I was simply Samantha, a girl who laughed freely and dared to imagine a life that belonged only to her. After months of stolen moments and whispered promises, he asked me to marry him. I was 19 and scared, but I also believed this was the doorway I had been waiting for. I said yes with tears in my eyes, not from fear, but from the sheer relief of thinking I had finally found my escape. For a while, it seemed like everything was falling into place. My father congratulated us with a weak smile, though he quickly stepped aside when Linda announced that she would handle the planning. Chloe smirked as though she knew something I did not, but I dismissed it as jealousy. I told myself she could not take this from me. Daniel and I visited St. Philip's Church in downtown Charleston, where the stained glass cast colors across the pews. I pictured myself walking down the aisle, my white dress trailing behind me. Daniel waiting at the altar with a smile that promised safety. We booked the reception at a hall near the waterfront where the windows opened to the harbor lights. For a brief season, I allowed myself to believe in happiness. Yet even in those bright moments, shadows crept at the edges. Linda criticized every choice I made, from the flowers to the invitations, as if reminding me that she still controlled the script. Chloe grew strangely close to Daniel, lingering too long in conversation, laughing too loudly at his jokes. I noticed but forced myself to ignore it. I told myself that paranoia would ruin me faster than betrayal. Looking back, I realized that was the lie I wanted most to believe. On the night before my wedding, as I laid my dress across the chair in my room, I whispered to myself that tomorrow would change everything. I thought love would finally silence the cruelty that had haunted me for years. I thought Daniel's hand would steady me as I walked into a new chapter. I thought Linda's voice and Chloe's shadow would fade into the background of my past. I thought wrong. The night before my wedding should have been filled with nervous laughter and dreams of tomorrow, but instead, it unfolded like a slow-moving nightmare. After the rehearsal dinner at Magnolia's Charleston, where guests toasted with champagne and Linda played the role of the proud stepmother, I returned to my room in the historic district with a heart that fluttered between excitement and unease. My dress hung neatly by the window, the lace catching the soft light of the street lamps, and for a moment, I allowed myself to picture how it would look when I walked down the aisle. I brushed my hair, whispered a quiet prayer, and told myself that happiness was finally within reach. Then Chloe knocked on my door. She carried a garment bag and a smile too bright for the hour. She said she wanted to help me choose the right nightgown for the honeymoon, something playful to surprise Daniel. I felt awkward, but grateful for the gesture. For once, it seemed she might be extending a hand of kindness. We talked briefly about colors and fabrics, and then she slipped out, saying she had to check something at her hotel room near Waterfront Park. It struck me as odd that she would not stay with me the night before such an important day, but I let it go. By midnight, the house was quiet, only the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. I sat at my desk to write a few lines in my journal, a habit I had kept since I was 13. I wrote about my hope that Daniel would be the partner who gave me the freedom my home never had. I wrote about my fear that Linda would find a way to ruin the ceremony. And then I wrote about my determination to leave those fears behind once I said I do. It was then that Daniel's laptop pinged. He had left it open on the desk after reviewing some last-minute arrangements earlier in the evening. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was a harmless notification, but when the second ping followed quickly after curiosity pulled my eyes to the glowing screen, a message preview appeared and my breath caught in my throat. The sender's name was Chloe, my stepsister. The words blurred as my eyes struggled to process what I was seeing. I clicked the message, my hands trembling so badly I could barely control the touchpad. The screen filled with sentences I will never forget. Chloe had written to Daniel less than 30 minutes earlier. She thanked him for the unforgettable night, told him that the way he touched her would stay in her mind forever, and promised that their secret was safe. She ended with a line that made my stomach twist. She said she almost felt guilty, but then laughed about how I would never know. My chest tightened, and my breath grew shallow. For a moment, I thought I might faint right there at the desk. I forced myself to scroll down, and with every line, the reality became more undeniable. She mentioned the hotel, the room number, even the detail that Daniel had ordered wine from the bar to make the evening feel more special. My heart pounded in my ears as if the room itself was closing in on me. I had spent years enduring Linda's cruelty and Chloe's mockery, and through it all, I told myself that Daniel was my escape. Now he was part of their world, not mine. I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, the message would vanish like a cruel trick of my imagination. But when I looked again, the evidence remained. I grabbed my phone and with shaking fingers photographed the screen from every angle. Years of living under Linda's thumb had taught me that proof was the only shield against lies. As the flash lit the room, tears blurred my vision. I wanted to scream, to break something, to storm into the night and demand answers, but I sat frozen. My body betrayed me heavy and weak, while my mind raced with questions that had no mercy. How long had this been happening? Was it just tonight, or had it stretched back for weeks, months? Had Chloe been smiling at me across the dinner table all this time with this secret tucked under her tongue? Had Daniel been holding my hand while dreaming of hers? The betrayal wrapped itself around me tighter than any chain Linda had ever placed on my life. For the first time, the house did not feel suffocating because of Linda. It felt suffocating because of the truth I could not unsee. I stood from the desk, my knees weak, and paced the room in silence. The sound of my footsteps against the hardwood floor was the only reminder that I was still in control of my body. My thoughts raced in jagged patterns, crashing into one another like waves in a storm. Every memory of Daniel over the past year, replayed in my mind, now stained with suspicion. The nights he said he was working late, the times he answered his phone in the other room, the looks that passed between him and Chloe when they thought no one was watching. My heart twisted as I realized these were not isolated moments. They were warning signs I had chosen to ignore because believing in love felt safer than questioning it. I needed more than a message to convince myself that this nightmare was real. Driven by equal parts fear and determination, I grabbed my jacket and slipped out into the Charleston night. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with salt and humidity, but inside me a storm raged. I followed the clues Chloe had carelessly left in her message, walking toward Waterfront Park, where the embassy suites rose against the skyline. My mind screamed at me to turn back, that I would regret what I was about to see, but my legs carried me forward. When I reached the hotel, I lingered in the shadows by the entrance, waiting, praying that I was wrong. But at 2 a.m, the lobby doors slid open, and there they were. Daniel walked out first, his shirt untucked, his hair tousled in a way I had once thought endearing. Chloe followed, adjusting her dress with a laugh that carried into the night. They did not see me at first, but I saw them clearly. The way she brushed his arm, the way he leaned close to whisper, the way their bodies moved with the intimacy of people who had crossed a line. My chest tightened until I thought it might split open. I raised my phone with hands that trembled but did not falter and snapped photo after photo, capturing their betrayal under the glow of the streetlights. Each click of the camera was a stab of pain and a surge of clarity. The truth was no longer just words on a screen. It was flesh and blood walking side by side, mocking every hope I had clung to. I lowered the phone and stepped back into the shadows, tears streaming down my face, my heart breaking silently in the humid Charleston night. I returned to my room just before dawn, my shoes damp from the wet pavement, my eyes burning from tears that refused to stop. I sank onto the edge of the bed and stared at the dress draped over the chair. Hours earlier, I had touched its lace with trembling excitement. Now it looked like a cruel joke, a costume for a role I could no longer play. My hands shook as I scrolled through the photos I had taken, each one a dagger, each one proof that the life I had imagined was nothing but an illusion. For a moment, I thought about running, disappearing into the morning without a word. I imagined leaving the dress behind, packing a small bag, and boarding a bus out of Charleston before anyone noticed. But as quickly as the thought appeared, it dissolved. Running would mean surrender. It would mean letting Linda smirk, letting Chloe laugh, letting Daniel walk away untouched. And after 19 years of swallowing my pain in silence, I could no longer bear the taste of it. The house was still dark, but my mind was awake in a way it had never been. I remembered the countless times Linda had humiliated me in front of neighbors, the sting of Chloe's cruel words, the weight of my father's silence. All of it pressed against me like hands forcing me down. And yet, beneath that pressure, something inside me hardened. I realized that I had two choices. I could become the broken girl they wanted me to be, or I could rise and show them that their betrayal would not be my undoing. The decision crystallized in that moment. I would not call off the wedding. I would not scream or cry in front of them. I would walk down that aisle exactly as they expected. But when I reached the altar, the truth would rise with me. I would take their secret, the one they thought they had hidden in the shadows, and I would drag it into the light before every guest, before God, before the very walls that had seen generations of vows. My heart steadied with the thought. The fear that had shaken me hours earlier gave way to a cold determination. The betrayal had stolen my illusion, but it had also given me something stronger than hope. It had given me resolve. As the first rays of sunlight broke across Charleston's rooftops, I wiped my face and whispered into the silence. Tomorrow would not be the day they destroyed me. Tomorrow would be the day I destroyed their lie. The morning light streamed through the curtains, but instead of softening the edges of my pain, it sharpened them. I had not slept. I could not. My mind was too busy weaving threads of anger and clarity into something that looked almost like a plan. Years of living under Linda's rules had taught me how to endure, but now I wanted more than endurance. I wanted to strike in a way that no one could dismiss, a way that would silence every cruel word she had ever spoken, every smirk Chloe had ever flashed, every promise Daniel had ever broken. I knew that shouting the truth in their faces would not be enough. They would deny, twist, manipulate. Linda had spent her entire life mastering the art of turning stories until she was the victim. Chloe had learned that same skill, smiling sweetly as she poisoned the air with lies. If I wanted justice, I needed proof so overwhelming that no excuse could survive it. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the photographs again. Each image of Daniel and Chloe outside the embassy suites was time-stamped. The screenshots of the messages glowed on my screen, damning and undeniable. Together, they formed a story that could not be erased. But it was not enough to have the truth. I needed to decide how to deliver it. That was when a memory surfaced. A wedding I had attended months earlier had included small envelopes at each place setting with a QR code that linked to a gallery of photos from the engagement shoot. Guests had laughed and scanned the code with their phones, delighted by the convenience. It was simple, effective, and memorable. An idea took shape. If guests at my wedding were expecting a keepsake, why not give them one that revealed the real story? My heart pounded as I pictured the scene. The priest would begin the ceremony, the guests would settle into quiet reverence, and then one by one they would scan the code. Whispers would ripple through the pews, faces would pale, gasps would echo, and just when the silence grew heaviest, I would step forward with the final blow. The thought filled me with a strange calm. For once, I was not the one trembling, not the one waiting for someone else to decide my fate. I was the one building the stage. Still, I knew I needed someone I could trust to make sure the plan was more than a desperate fantasy. My mind went to Rebecca Hayes, a friend from high school who had left Charleston to study law at USC Columbia. She was sharp, unafraid, and most importantly, she had never judged me for the chaos of my family. I hesitated before dialing her number. It was nearly 2 a.m, and I wondered if she would even answer. But when her sleepy voice came through the line, I poured everything out. The betrayal, the photos, the plan. I expected her to tell me I was crazy. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment before saying words that steadied me. "Samantha, what they did is cruel beyond measure. You deserve to be free of this, and if exposing the truth is what it takes, then I will stand by you. But you need to document everything carefully. Do not sign any papers tomorrow. And remember, once you do this, there is no going back." I could feel my chest tighten and loosen like a bellows as Rebecca and I laid out the details. She spoke in a voice that belonged to someone who spent her days untangling arguments and her nights reading statutes calm and precise. We agreed that evidence had to be bulletproof. No ambiguous phrases, no suggestive innuendo. We cataloged the messages, the timestamps, the photos, and the hotel receipt I had managed to photograph from the parking lot. Rebecca told me to make multiple backups and to upload everything to a secure cloud with a hashed file name so nothing could be altered later. She offered to create a read-only folder and to timestamp our access so that if anyone tried to claim fabrication, we would have a legal record of when each file was uploaded. Her practical voice steadied mine. Next came the delivery method. The QR idea felt both modern and cruelly elegant. People would expect small sentimental tokens, not the unspooling of a secret. I sketched the guest card in my head, imagining the polite cursive that Linda would approve of, and the tiny line that would read, "For our guests with love." It would look like any other thoughtful touch. Only when they scanned it would the truth appear on their screens. I called the wedding coordinator Janet and asked if she could discreetly print a set of cards in the hotel business center that morning. Janet was professional and kind, the kind of person who believed weddings were sacred and always tried to keep the bride calm. I did not want to drag her into a maelstrom, but I needed someone who would not ask questions and who would trust the bride. I framed the request as an extra favor, a special surprise for guests who loved behind-the-scenes photos. Janet agreed, and I breathed a little easier. There were practicalities to consider. The QR had to link to a page that would not be immediately searchable, something private and fast. Rebecca set up the folder, and I uploaded 3 versions of the gallery, each with different file names, and a master copy hidden behind a simple web page. Then she created the QR code and sent it to me encrypted. I had the cards printed on a small printer in the hotel business center, a professional-looking stock that would not arouse suspicion. I watched as Janet tucked them into envelopes and labeled them with calligraphy, each one an innocuous trap. As the hours passed, I oscillated between feeling godlike with power and deeply unsettled by what I was about to unleash. There were moments when doubt crept in whispers that told me I could have chosen a quieter escape, that exposing them would ruin more than their reputations. I thought of my father and how the shame of public scandal might crush him. I thought of neighbors who would whisper and of my own future being cataloged in news articles. Yet every time the doubt grew loud, I returned to the image of Chloe and Daniel laughing as they walked into the hotel lobby the way they had betrayed me with casual cruelty. That memory hardened into something like resolve. Rebecca warned me again to avoid physical confrontation, to let the evidence do the work. She said that courts and public opinion are less forgiving when anger leads to violence. That advice felt like a tether. I promised her I would not let rage unmoor me. By the time the sun slid toward late afternoon, I had 3 sealed boxes of cards ready in Janet's care, a legal ally waiting in the wings, and a cloud folder with every file securely preserved. The plan was in motion, and for the first time since I had discovered the betrayal, I slept a little that night, not because I was at peace, but because I had harnessed my fear into purpose. The rehearsal brought everyone together with the false warmth of celebration, as if laughter could smooth over the electric tension that wrapped around me. Linda took charge of every minute, directing seating arrangements and floral displays with the kind of certainty that suggested she believed nothing could unravel her careful design. Chloe hovered like a glossy shadow, smiling at the right moments, planting small questions in conversation so that whispers would travel further than direct accusations. My father moved through the room like a man avoiding a storm he could not control. I sat at the edge of a table and watched faces I had known my whole life fall into the pattern of scripted congratulations. Inside, I was shaking, but my exterior was composed because composition is a language I had perfected. Before the rehearsal ended, I slipped away to find Janet and handed her the sealed boxes. Her eyes flicked to mine, and in that brief exchange, I felt the weight of an ally's understanding. She would place the cards quietly during the ceremony, folded into the program, unassuming, a little secret disguised as a keepsake. Rebecca arrived that evening and took her place among the guests as if she were a cousin or an old friend. She texted me twice with simple reminders: stay calm, do not sign anything, let the evidence speak. Her presence steadied me more than she would know. That night, I finished the final touches on the web page, checking and rechecking the links until every file opened correctly and each timestamp was visible. I tested the QR code on my phone more times than I could count, watching the images load and feeling a small surgical satisfaction when each one displayed exactly as intended. There were practical details that took up more room in my head than the fear itself. I had to choose the moment to step forward, the turn of phrase that would expose them without inviting legal retaliation for slander, the way to hold the microphone so that my voice carried without shaking. I practiced the opening line in the mirror until it felt like a blade I could use with precision. Outside, Charleston was quiet and luminous under the early autumn sky, but inside me the hours kept slipping toward the inevitable. At home, Linda fussed over last-minute calls, arranging seating, ensuring the photographer knew where to stand for optimal angles. She told our neighbors that everything would be perfect, that nobody would suspect a thing. Her certainty made my stomach churn, because certainty often hides the deepest fear. I thought about my father in his study leafing through bank statements and pretending to be distracted by work, while his daughter was preparing to undo a life he had silently allowed to be built on control. There were moments of doubt, quick and fierce, when I imagined the scandal swallowing us all and my father's fragile dignity collapsing under the weight of public shame. I imagined reporters at our doorstep and neighbors pointing fingers and whispers trailing me down King Street. I imagined the cost of exposing the truth. Each thought was a possible outcome I had to accept before stepping forward. Then I pictured Chloe and Daniel laughing in the hotel lobby, their betrayal casual and uncaring, and the image hardened into resolve. If people were going to hurt me by pretending nothing was wrong, then I would refuse to be quiet for their comfort. At midnight, I laid my dress out, smoothing the fabric with hands that still trembled sometimes but were steadier than they had been a day earlier. I breathed and told myself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Rebecca whispered one last legal reminder before we parted: document every reaction. Keep receipts, do not engage physically no matter what. Her instructions were a tether to prudence. I slept in fits and starts, not from peace, but from a readiness sharpened into something like purpose. When dawn came, I dressed and walked toward St. Philip's Church, with the cards tucked into the programs and reality pressing against my ribs like a drum. I walked not as someone fleeing pain, but as someone bringing truth into a room that had been built to ignore it. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of Charleston autumn day where the air is crisp, but the sun lays a soft glow across the rooftops. I rose before the alarm rang, my body tense with anticipation. My dress hung ready, a simple white gown that felt less like a promise and more like armor now. As I slipped into it, smoothing the fabric with steady hands, I reminded myself that every detail of this day was a stage I had chosen to walk onto, not a prison I had been dragged into. Linda knocked once and swept into the room without waiting for my answer. Her eyes glittered with the triumph of someone who believed she had arranged every piece to her satisfaction. She fussed with the veil tugged at the hem, criticized the way I stood. I met her gaze in the mirror and forced myself to smile faintly, letting her think she still held the strings. In truth, I was already pulling them myself. Chloe entered next, wearing her bridesmaid's dress in soft lavender. She looked radiant to anyone who did not know better, but to me, her beauty was a mask that barely concealed arrogance. She kissed my cheek lightly and whispered that Daniel was waiting with the most handsome smile. Her words were honey laced with venom, and for a moment my chest constricted. I steadied myself by picturing the cards tucked inside the programs, silent bombs waiting to be opened. My father arrived last, adjusting his tie, nervously avoiding my eyes as though afraid to see what they might reveal. He told me I looked like my mother, and for the briefest second the sincerity in his voice cracked through the walls I had built. I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded, and told him thank you. Then I walked past him down the corridor toward the waiting carriage that would take us to St. Philip's. The church loomed with solemn grace, its steeple piercing the sky bells tolling to announce what the city believed was a celebration of love. Guests filed in, dressed in their finest suits and dresses, pearls, glinting shoes, polished conversations, light and cheerful. I watched from the vestibule as ushers handed out the programs, each containing the card with the elegant script and the discreet QR code. My heart thudded as I imagined the ripple that would begin the moment the first phone scanned it. I kept my face serene, nodding to the coordinator, whispering to my bridesmaids, pretending I was just another bride fighting nervous jitters. But beneath the surface, my mind ticked like a clock counting down. The organ began to play. The guests rose, and the doors opened wide. I stepped forward into the aisle veil, framing my face, bouquet trembling slightly in my hands. The pews blurred into a sea of smiles, unaware that their joy was seconds away from fracture. I lifted my chin and walked slowly, each step a deliberate act of defiance. Daniel waited at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo eyes, shining with the performance of devotion. Chloe stood nearby, her gaze steady, her lips curved in a secretive smile. Linda sat in the front pew, straight-backed, radiating pride. They thought they had built a perfect tableau. They had no idea the stage was rigged to collapse beneath them. As I reached the altar, Daniel extended his hand and I placed mine in his, though every nerve in my body recoiled from his touch. The organ faded, the guests settled, and Father Mackenzie began to speak the solemn words that had blessed countless unions before mine. His voice rose with reverence about trust, about fidelity, about the sacred vows soon to be spoken. Each phrase struck me like an accusation. I glanced toward the pews and caught sight of Janet moving gracefully between rows, her smile polite, her hands distributing the folded programs with the cards inside. The guests accepted them without suspicion, sliding them into purses and jacket pockets, some opening them immediately, curious for what surprises we had prepared. My pulse raced. From the corner of my eye, I saw Uncle Richard lean over to his wife as he scanned the card with his phone. At first, his brow furrowed in confusion, then his mouth fell open in disbelief. He turned the screen toward her and she gasped, covering her lips with trembling fingers. A ripple began, subtle at first, then spreading like fire through dry grass. Cousins shifted in their seats. Colleagues whispered neighbors passed phones down the pews. I could almost feel the weight of their stares pressing against my back. Daniel, oblivious, tightened his grip on my hand as though steadying me. Chloe's eyes flickered, catching the movement in the congregation, but she dismissed it with a faint smirk. Linda tilted her head, puzzled by the growing murmur, but her posture remained regal, confident that nothing could spoil her carefully curated day. The priest continued asking if anyone gathered here knew of any reason why this union should not take place. The timing was almost divine. The silence that followed was filled with the quiet buzz of dozens of phones, with gasps slipping through lips, with the sound of truth spreading faster than denial could chase it. I inhaled deeply, my chest rising, my heart steady for the first time in days. I stepped forward and gently pulled my hand from Daniel's. His smile faltered. The congregation stilled, waiting, sensing the shift in air. I looked out over the crowd, at family, at friends, at strangers who had all come to witness a union, but were now witnesses to something else entirely. "Yes," I said, my voice clear, carrying across the vaulted ceiling. "There is a reason." Gasps echoed. Daniel's eyes widened. Chloe stiffened. Linda's smile cracked. I turned first to Daniel, the man who had promised me freedom and delivered betrayal instead. Last night, I said each word sharp. The man I was meant to marry spent his night not preparing for this moment, but in a hotel room with my stepsister. A wave of shock swept through the pews, audible and raw. Phones lifted higher proof already glowing on their screens, confirmation undeniable. I turned to Chloe, who paled beneath her flawless makeup. "You called yourself my sister. You told me to trust you, and yet you betrayed me with the one person I trusted most." Then I faced Linda, whose eyes now burned with panic. "And you?" I said, my voice trembling but strong, the woman who called herself my mother, who raised her hand not to bless me but to control me. "You created this house of lies." The church was silent for a heartbeat, every face locked on us, waiting for what would come next. The silence inside St. Philip's broke like glass under a hammer. Guests erupted in gasps and murmurs, some rising to their feet, others twisting in the pews to confirm what they had seen on their phones. The proof was undeniable, and the weight of it pressed against the air until even the stained glass saints seemed to tremble. Daniel stammered, his face draining of color. "Samantha, wait! This isn't—" His voice cracked too weak against the tide of evidence already spreading through the congregation. Chloe's composure crumbled faster than his. She stepped forward, her lavender dress swishing, and hissed under her breath. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to." But the words died as the crowd around her turned their heads, whispering, pointing, recoiling. The aura of charm she had always carried dissolved into shame. Linda shot to her feet, her chair clattering against the marble floor. her face once carefully painted with pride, now contorted with fury. She stormed down the aisle, each step echoing like a threat. Enough of this nonsense, she barked, her voice slicing through the chaos. You dare humiliate us like this? I stood my ground, though my knees trembled. Humiliation belongs to the guilty, not the truth, I answered, my voice amplified by the microphone still in my hand. Laughter broke from a cluster of guests near the back, the kind of laugh born not of humor, but disbelief at the audacity laid bare. Linda reached me at the altar, her breath sharp with rage. Before anyone could stop her, she lunged, and her hands closed around my throat. The congregation shrieked as my bouquet clattered to the floor. Her grip was iron years of suppressed cruelty now unleashed in front of everyone she had once charmed. For a moment, black spots danced at the edges of my vision, but adrenaline surged and I shoved back, clawing at her wrists, refusing to collapse. Daniel froze, caught between shame and cowardice, his mouth opening and closing without sound. My father rose halfway from his seat, his hands twitching, but he faltered, as always too weak to act. It was the guests who moved. Several rushed forward, pulling Linda's arms away, prying her fingers from my skin as the priest shouted for order. Someone shouted to call the police, another screamed for security. Chloe sobbed, her mascara streaking as she tried to pull her mother back, but even that attempt looked half-hearted, more fear of exposure than love. My throat burned where her nails had dug into the skin, but my voice returned with a strength that startled even me. I turned back to the microphone, my breathing ragged, but words cutting through the uproar. This is the woman who wanted to control me. This is the sister who betrayed me. This is the man who vowed to love me while lying in her bed. And this, I gestured to the guests holding up their phones, is the truth you all deserve to see. The church had dissolved into chaos. Some guests tried to console my mother, who sat weeping openly. Others argued in hushed but heated tones. Cameras flashed, phones recorded history being captured in real time. What was meant to be the celebration of a union had become the funeral of a lie, and I was still standing. The doors of St. Philip's burst open just as Linda's shrieks still rang through the vaulted ceiling. Two uniformed officers hurried down the aisle, their radios crackling, their boots striking the stone floor in a rhythm that silenced even the loudest whispers. Guests parted instinctively, their fine clothes brushing against the pews as they pulled back, creating a clear path. The officers reached the altar, and one of them gently but firmly gripped Linda's arm. She fought against the hold, her voice breaking with outrage. "This is my daughter's wedding, you can't!" But her words were drowned beneath the sight of half the congregation pointing their phones at her, evidence already circulating beyond these walls. The second officer asked me if I was hurt, his eyes dropping to the red marks blooming across my neck. I touched the tender skin, the ache sharp but bearable. She attacked me in front of everyone, I said, my voice hoarse yet steady. That was enough. They turned Linda around, pressing her wrists together, and the metallic click of handcuffs cut through the stunned silence. A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd as she was led down the aisle, still protesting her dignity stripped away, one step at a time. Daniel made a desperate move, then grabbing the microphone I had dropped onto the altar. "Listen, this isn't what it looks like," he pleaded, his voice cracking with false sincerity. "It was a mistake. Just one mistake." His words were met with a chorus of disbelief. Guests shouted back at him, voices rising above his stammer. "We saw the messages," someone yelled. "We saw the photos," another cried. His excuses drowned in the sea of evidence. Chloe collapsed onto the front pew, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. No one reached for her. Even the friends who once orbited her charm now recoiled, unwilling to be tainted by the scandal unfolding in real time. I stood, my dress slightly wrinkled, my veil slipping from my hair, but my spine straighter than it had ever been. I lifted my chin and faced the crowd. "There will be no vows today," I said firmly, my voice carrying over the chaos. "There will be no union built on betrayal. What you have witnessed is not the destruction of a wedding. It is the unveiling of the truth." For a moment, the church fell quiet again, the kind of hush that follows a storm, when the world waits to see what remains standing. My father finally rose, but it was too late. He looked at me with eyes full of sorrow, perhaps shame, but he said nothing. The silence between us was louder than any words. Guests began to file out, some shaking their heads, others clutching their phones as though the story itself were too heavy to carry. The police escorted Linda into the bright Charleston afternoon, where reporters had already begun to gather, tipped off by guests who could not resist the pull of scandal. The scene at the altar remained frozen in my memory. Daniel, pale and sweating. Chloe unraveling my mother, weeping into a handkerchief, and me no longer the frightened girl they thought they controlled, but the woman who had chosen truth over silence. The hours after the ceremony unraveled like a fever dream. I left the church with the marks of Linda's fingers still burning across my throat, but I walked with my head high while whispers chased me down the steps. Guests spilled into the courtyard, some avoiding my gaze, others offering soft words of support, but all of them stunned by what they had just witnessed. The air smelled of magnolia and salt from the harbor, yet it carried the bitter weight of scandal. I knew then that my story had escaped the church walls. It was already out in the world, flying through text messages and social media feeds, twisting into headlines I had not yet read. Daniel tried to follow me into the courtyard, his tuxedo-disheveled desperation clinging to him like sweat. "Samantha, wait, we can fix this," he begged, reaching for my arm. I turned on him with all the fury that 19 years of silence had been storing. "Fix this! You destroyed it. You destroyed me." My voice cracked, but not from weakness, from release. He froze, his hand hanging helpless in the air, and then my cousin stepped between us, shaking his head firmly. "Walk away, Daniel. You've done enough." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line as if words were still clawing to escape, but the chorus of angry stares around him silenced him more effectively than I ever could. Chloe lingered by the church doors, her lavender dress stained with tears and streaked mascara. She called my name once, her voice trembling. For a moment, the younger version of me wanted to turn, wanted to hear her excuse, wanted to understand why. But I kept walking. Some betrayals are so sharp that no explanation can dull their edge. By evening, the fallout had begun. My phone buzzed endlessly with messages from classmates, distant relatives, even strangers who had seen the posts online. Screenshots of the evidence spread like wildfire across Facebook and Instagram. Some wrote words of sympathy, others words of admiration, and a few words of curiosity too sharp to bear. "Is it true? How did you find out? Are you okay?" I ignored them all. My story was no longer just mine. It had become public property, and the only way I could survive it was by refusing to feed the fire. At home, my mother sat at the kitchen table, her face pale with grief. She had watched her husband's silence, her stepdaughter's betrayal, and her own humiliation all in one afternoon. "I never thought," she whispered, her words trailing into nothing. I sat across from her, the silence between us filled with years of unspoken pain. Finally, I reached across the table and took her hand. "It's over now," I told her softly. "The truth is out." Her tears spilled freely, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same side of the storm. But as night fell, I knew this was only the beginning. The scandal had cracked open, but the real consequences were still on their way, waiting like a tide about to rise and sweep through every life it touched. By the next morning, Charleston was buzzing, and Daniel's name was on the lips of people who had never met him. The video clips recorded by guests at St. Philip's had already been shared thousands of times. Strangers dissected his every gesture, the way his face drained of color when I spoke, the way he fumbled for excuses, the way he stood frozen as Linda's hands closed around my throat. He became a spectacle, and there was no escape. At the shipyard in Mount Pleasant, where he had worked with quiet pride, the whispers spread faster than the clang of hammers on steel. His foreman called him into the office and told him bluntly that the company could not keep an employee whose name was now linked with scandal and disgrace. "We're a family business," the man said, "and families won't bring their contracts here if you're part of the story." By noon, Daniel's job was gone, and so was the small measure of respect he had built among his co-workers. His own family, the Brookses, who had welcomed me with warm Sunday dinners and thoughtful questions about my future, turned on him with equal parts shame and fury. His mother wept in the grocery store when someone muttered, "There's the mother of that cheating groom," and she refused to answer his calls. His father told him to stay away from the house until he could learn what honor meant. Daniel was left adrift, stripped of both work and family, and the pity I might once have felt had burned away with the image of him walking out of that hotel with Chloe. Chloe's fall came just as swiftly. At the College of Charleston, where she had strutted through the campus with an air of superiority, the story spread like a virus. Students shared the screenshots in group chats and posted memes mocking her betrayal. Professors could not ignore the distraction her presence created, and within days she was summoned to a disciplinary board. Her conduct was deemed unbecoming of a student representing the college, and she was suspended pending further review. Her friends, those who once orbited her charm, abandoned her afraid of being tainted by association. I heard whispers that Chloe had tried to return home, only to find Linda gone, and my father too stunned to offer comfort. She wandered from one friend's couch to another, her pride shattered, her future uncertain. Some nights I imagined her staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice that had led her to this point, realizing that the smirks and secrets she had once wielded like weapons had become shackles she could not break. Yet even as their lives unraveled, I felt no triumph. Watching them fall did not erase the bruise on my neck or the hollow ache in my chest. What it did was prove something I had long suspected. Lies always bloom fast, bright, and poisonous, but truth has deeper roots. And when it finally rises, it pulls down everything that tries to grow above it. If Daniel and Chloe's downfall was swift, Linda's collapse was spectacular. The morning after the wedding, her flower shop on King Street opened as usual, but customers whispered before even crossing the threshold. Photos of her being led out of St. Philip's in handcuffs had already hit the front page of the Post and Courier. Reporters camped outside, shoving microphones toward anyone who had once bought so much as a daisy from her. Brides who had booked floral arrangements for their weddings canceled within hours, their deposits sacrificed just to avoid the stain of her name on their day. By the end of the week, the shop was empty, the windows smudged, the once proud displays of orchids and roses replaced with dust and silence. Linda's arrest became more than gossip, it became a legal burden. She was charged with assault, and though her lawyer tried to spin the story as a misunderstanding, there were too many witnesses, too many phones capturing the truth. The court date loomed like a storm cloud, and the woman who had once strutted through Charleston society now kept her head-down sunglasses hiding eyes that had lost their fire. For the first time in years, her voice was not commanding anyone. It was pleading, bargaining, fading. And my father Mark was caught in the wreckage of his own silence. Neighbors who once waved politely when he watered the lawn now crossed the street to avoid him. At the bank, colleagues whispered about how he had allowed his new wife to destroy not only his daughter's wedding, but also his own reputation. Promotions he had quietly hoped for evaporated, and his manager suggested in the soft tone reserved for failures that perhaps early retirement would be best. At home, he drowned his shame in bourbon, the clink of ice against glass echoing in the rooms that had once been filled with Linda's sharp orders. I visited once weeks later to collect a few belongings I had left behind. The house felt smaller, suffocated by the weight of disappointment. My father sat in his recliner, the TV glowing but unwatched, his shoulders slumped. He tried to meet my eyes, but the words he needed had abandoned him long ago. "I'm sorry," he whispered finally, his voice frayed. It was the kind of apology that comes not from guilt, but from defeat. I nodded because there was nothing left to say. Linda was nowhere to be seen. I learned later she had moved into a small apartment above a laundromat on the outskirts of town, her empire reduced to wilted flowers and unpaid bills. For all her years of control, of cruelty, of convincing others, she was untouchable. She ended where every tyrant eventually does, isolated, disgraced, and forgotten by the very people she had tried to impress. Watching their unraveling did not bring joy, but it brought clarity. Linda and my father had built a house on silence and control, and when truth entered, it split the walls until nothing could stand. The nights after the wedding were the hardest. I would lie in my small rented room in Mount Pleasant staring at the ceiling, my throat still tender, my heart raw. The silence was thick, broken only by the buzz of my phone as more messages poured in. At first, I ignored them all, afraid to face the world beyond my own walls. But one evening, I opened a message from a woman I had never met. She wrote, "I saw what you did at St. Philip's. My stepfather used to control me, too. You gave me courage. I read it twice then, 3 times, tears slipping down my cheeks. That message opened a floodgate. Soon I was reading dozens more men and women from Charleston and beyond, sharing stories of betrayal of toxic families, of finding their own voices. It startled me to realize that what had felt like my private humiliation had become in some way a beacon for others. Local media painted me as the young bride who exposed betrayal in the most public way possible. Reporters camped outside my mother's porch for days, hoping I would speak. I refused interviews at first, but when the Post and Courier reached out with an offer to let me tell the story in my own words, I agreed. I insisted it not be sensationalized. I wanted to talk about the dangers of silence, about how family can wound as deeply as strangers, about the strength it takes to walk away. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, and for the first time I felt that my voice had power beyond my pain. Support flowed from unexpected places. Neighbors who had once believed Linda's lies now stopped me on the street to offer kindness. A librarian I had worked with during high school pressed a note into my hand that read, "You always had more courage than you realized." Even my boss at the cafe where I picked up shifts told me that my resilience inspired her daughter. Their words stitched me back together thread by thread. Yet healing was not a straight path. Some nights I cried until dawn, mourning the love I had thought would save me. I mourned the father who had chosen silence over protection, the sister who had chosen envy over loyalty, the stepmother who had chosen control over love. Grief was its own kind of shadow, and I carried it with me. But with each passing day, I also carried something brighter. I enrolled in evening classes using the scholarship offer I had once thrown away as motivation to reapply. When the acceptance letter arrived from the College of Charleston, I held it like a lifeline. It was proof that betrayal had not ended me. It had set me free to begin again. One evening, as the sun sank low over the harbor, painting the water gold, I walked along the Battery with my mother by my side. We didn't speak much, but her hand slipped into mine. For the first time in years, we walked not as captives of Linda's rule, but as survivors, stepping into the fragile light of a new beginning. 3 months after the wedding that never was, Charleston finally felt different to me. For years, the city had been a map of scars. King Street meant Linda's flower shop waterfront park, meant Chloe's laughter, and Mount Pleasant meant promises Daniel could not keep. But slowly, step by step, I began to reclaim those places. I walked King Street without lowering my eyes, daring to pass the boarded-up shop that had once been Linda's empire. I let the salty air of the harbor sting my skin, not with memory, but with renewal. I even stood outside the shipyard gates in Mount Pleasant one afternoon just to remind myself that his fall had nothing to do with my worth. The community's reaction remained mixed. Some praised me for my courage, while others whispered that I had been too ruthless, that I should have ended things quietly. At 19, I already knew that people will always try to rewrite your story for their comfort. What mattered was that I had finally claimed mine. My story was not about cruelty, though cruelty had shaped it. It was about refusing to let betrayal define the rest of my life. I threw myself into classes at the College of Charleston, sitting among students who saw me not as the girl from the scandal, but simply as Samantha. I studied literature with a hunger that surprised even me, losing myself in the rhythm of words, the power of stories to heal. In quiet corners of the library, I wrote my own essays, raw accounts of what it means to grow up in a house ruled by silence and fear. My professors encouraged me to submit one of those essays to a local writing competition, and when it won first place, I held the certificate in my hands and thought, this is the beginning. My mother became my anchor. We shared dinners in our small apartment, simple meals of pasta or soup that tasted better than any feast I had endured under Linda's watchful eye. Sometimes she still cried, mourning the decades she had lost to a man who refused to protect his own daughter, but there was strength in her tears now. She told me I should have left long ago, Samantha, but you gave me the courage I didn't know I had. For once, I realized I was not just surviving for myself. I was showing her that survival could be followed by freedom. Yet late at night, when the city lights flickered outside my window, I still wrestled with shadows. I asked myself if exposing Daniel and Chloe so publicly had made me cruel. I asked if Linda's downfall was justice or vengeance, and I asked if forgiveness was possible when the wounds still burned. Those questions had no easy answers, but living with them felt less like punishment and more like proof that I was still human. I knew I could not move forward without facing my father one last time. For weeks, I avoided him letting his calls go unanswered, his letters unopened. Part of me wanted to erase him from my life altogether to imagine he had vanished with Linda and the wreckage of their choices. But blood has a way of lingering in memory, and deep inside I carried the ache of the little girl who had once looked for her father's protection and found only silence. One late afternoon, I walked back to the old house on Wentworth Street. The shutters were closed, the yard overgrown the pride Linda once demanded gone like smoke. My father opened the door before I even knocked. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, his eyes red. He invited me in with a voice that cracked like an old record. The living room was cluttered with half-empty glasses and unopened mail. I sat across from him, every muscle in my body tight. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "I failed you, Samantha. I failed in ways I can't repair." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his voice trembling. "I thought keeping peace in this house was protecting you. I thought if I stayed quiet, the storm would pass. But I see now it wasn't peace. It was cowardice." Hearing him admit what I had always known stung worse than if he had denied it. The child in me wanted to scream, to demand why he never stood between Linda and me. Why he let Chloe's cruelty go unchecked. Why he let me believe escape would come from a man who turned out to be another betrayal. But instead, I found myself whispering, "You were supposed to be my father." Tears spilled down his face. He bowed his head like a man kneeling at an altar. I know, and I wasn't. The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken pain. Finally, I took a deep breath and said the words that had been forming in me ever since that day at the church. "I forgive you, not because you earned it, but because I cannot carry this weight any longer. Forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me." He looked up startled, as though he had expected anger, not release. His lips trembled, searching for thanks, but none came. Forgiveness did not mean reconciliation, not in this case. It meant I was setting myself free from his weakness, from the chain that had bound me to his silence. I rose from the chair, smoothing my coat, and headed for the door. At the threshold, I paused and looked back. "Take care of yourself, Dad. I hope one day you find the strength you never showed me." Then I walked out into the fading Charleston light. The air smelled of salt and change. Behind me, the door closed with a quiet click, and with it, a chapter of my life finally shut. After closing the door on my father, I felt as if I had stepped into uncharted territory. For the first time in my life, my choices were not bound by Linda's commands, Chloe's smirks, or my father's silence. The freedom was intoxicating, but also terrifying. I had to decide who I wanted to become, not just who I no longer was. College became more than a classroom for me, it became a sanctuary. I sat in lecture halls at the College of Charleston, notebook open pen, poised hungry for knowledge. Literature classes gave me words for feelings I had carried in silence. Psychology courses helped me understand patterns of control and trauma not as my private curse, but as something many endured and many overcame. Each assignment I turned in felt like a brick laid on the foundation of a life I was building for myself. Outside of school, I joined a local support group called Survivors of Family Abuse. The meetings were held in a church basement, the walls plain, the chairs folding metal, but inside those walls I found something precious: understanding. We sat in a circle, strangers bound by scars we rarely showed others. I told my story haltingly at first, expecting judgment, but instead heads nodded, hands reached out, voices whispered, "Me too." Their stories were different, some about fathers, some about partners, some about siblings, but the common thread was the same: survival. For the first time, I felt less alone. The group encouraged me to speak publicly, to use my experience as fuel for awareness. At first, the idea terrified me. I thought of the stares I had endured in Charleston after the wedding scandal and shuddered. But when I finally stood in front of a small crowd at a community center, my voice shook for only the first few sentences. Then it steadied. I spoke about silence, about how dangerous it is to mistake it for peace, about how control can masquerade as love. When I finished, The applause wasn't loud, it was soft, respectful, the kind that told me my words had reached someone. That was enough. Slowly, my life began to take on a rhythm that wasn't defined by chaos. I worked part-time at a bookstore where the smell of old paper and the quiet hum of readers soothed me. My mother and I built new traditions, Sunday morning walks along the Battery Friday dinners with laughter instead of criticism. Sometimes when I caught her smiling across the table, I realized we were both learning how to live again. Yet I never pretended healing was simple. There were nights when nightmares dragged me back to the altar, Linda's hands at my throat. There were days when the sight of a lavender dress made my stomach twist with memory. But instead of drowning in those moments, I began to write them down, turning pain into prose, shadows into stories. Each page I filled was a reminder that I could shape my own narrative. For the first time, my life wasn't about escape. It was about becoming. It took me months before I could imagine trusting anyone again. Love, once my promised escape, had become a wound I was afraid to touch. But life has a way of nudging you forward even when you resist. It happened quietly in the most ordinary of places, the bookstore where I worked part-time. His name was Ethan Miller, a graduate student in history at the College of Charleston. He came in every week to browse the shelves, always lingering in the same aisle where biographies met memoirs. At first, I only noticed the way he treated books with careful hands, almost reverent, as though each page deserved respect. Then I noticed the way he treated people. He said thank you to the cashier, held the door open for strangers, and never once looked at me with the kind of scrutiny I had grown up enduring. One rainy afternoon, he asked if I could recommend something that wasn't just about kings and wars, but about resilience. The word caught me off guard, but I led him to a memoir written by a woman who had rebuilt her life after loss. He smiled when he took it from me, and something in that smile felt safe. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a sweeping romance. It was a quiet acknowledgement that kindness still existed. Weeks turned into conversations. He would ask about my classes, and I found myself sharing pieces of my story carefully at first, then with more trust. When I admitted that I had once stood at the altar only to watch my future collapse, he didn't flinch or pry. He simply said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. You deserved better." Those words, so simple, felt like a balm. I didn't fall quickly. I tested every word, every gesture, like touching a bruise to see if it still hurt. But Ethan never pushed. He walked beside me on my terms, letting me set the pace. He invited me to a small study group, then to coffee, then to a concert on the green. Each time I told myself I could back out. Each time I found I didn't want to. One evening we sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, the air crisp with salt and the sound of waves echoing against the seawall. He turned to me and said, "You've been through so much, Samantha, but I hope you know that your story doesn't end there. Sometimes the best chapters come after the hardest ones." For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe him. I wasn't in love yet, not the way I once thought love had to be a desperate grasp for freedom. What I felt was steadier, gentler, built on honesty instead of illusion. It was the faint outline of hope, the whisper that maybe one day I could love again, not because I needed escape, but because I finally understood my worth. 6 months after the day my world shattered at St. Philip's, I stood once more inside a church. This time, not as a bride, not as a daughter of silence, but as a speaker. The Survivors of Family Abuse group had asked me to share my story at a public forum. I hesitated at first, wondering if opening old wounds in front of strangers would undo the healing I had fought so hard to build. But when I looked at my reflection that morning, I saw not the girl who once trembled under Linda's shadow, but a young woman who had found her voice. The pews were filled with faces carrying their own burdens. Some eyes were tired, some hopeful, all searching. When I stepped up to the podium, my throat tightened, remembering the microphone at the altar and the chaos that followed. But this time there was no fear. I began with the truth. My name is Samantha Whitmore. I was supposed to marry the man I thought would save me. Instead, I discovered betrayal from the very people I trusted most. What happened next nearly broke me, but it also set me free. As I spoke, I watched heads nod, tears fall, hands squeezed together in solidarity. I told them about Linda's control, about Chloe's envy, about my father's silence. I told them about Daniel's betrayal and the photos that became my sword. But I also told them about the bookstore, about college classes, about evenings walking along the Battery with my mother, about learning to breathe without fear. I wanted them to see that survival was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new one. When I finished, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady, heartfelt, the kind of sound that lingers longer than noise. Afterward, a woman approached me, her teenage daughter at her side. With tears in her eyes, she said, "Thank you. You gave us the courage to leave." In that moment, I realized the true power of truth. It doesn't just liberate the one who speaks it, it can light the way for those still searching. Looking back, I no longer saw my wedding day as the day my life ended. I saw it as the day the mask was torn away, the day I stopped waiting for someone else to rescue me, the day I chose to rescue myself. The scars remained, yes, but they had become proof of survival, not symbols of shame. To anyone listening, I would say this family is not defined by blood or tradition. It is defined by love, respect, and safety. Silence is not peace, it is surrender. And betrayal, as devastating as it feels, can be the soil from which strength grows. As the evening sun streamed through the stained glass windows, I felt a strange peace settle inside me. My story was not neat, not painless, but it was mine. And finally, I knew that was enough.